The Los Amigos Fiasco by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Los Amigos Fiasco by Arthur Conan Doyle. I used to be the leading practitioner of Los Amigos. Of course, everyone has heard of the great electrical generating gear there. The town is widespread, and there are dozens of little townlets and villages all around, which receive their supply from the same center, so that the works are on a very large scale. The Los Amigos folk say that they are the largest upon earth. But then we claim that for everything in Los Amigos, except the jail and the death rate. These are said to be the smallest. Now, with so fine an electrical supply, it seemed to be a sinful waste of hemp that the Los Amigos criminals should perish in the old-fashioned manner. And then came the news of the electrocutions in the East, and how the results had not, after all, been so instantaneous as had been hoped. The Western engineers raised their eyebrows when they read of the puny shocks by which these men had perished, and they vowed in Los Amigos that when an irreclaimable came their way, he should be dealt handsomely by, and have the run of all the big dynamos. There should be no reserve, said the engineers, but he should have all that they had got. And what the result of that would be, none could predict, save that it must be absolutely blasting and deadly. Never before had a man been so charged with electricity as they would charge him. He was to be smitten by the essence of 10 thunderbolts. Some prophesied combustion, and some disintegration and disappearance. They were waiting eagerly to settle the question by actual demonstration, and it was just at that moment that Duncan Warner came that way. Warner had been wanted by the law, and by nobody else, for many years. Desperado, murderer, train robber, and road agent, he was a man beyond the pale of human pity. He had deserved a dozen deaths, and the Los Amigos folk grudged him so gaudy a one as that. He seemed to feel himself to be unworthy of it, for he made 2 frenzied attempts at escape. He was a powerful, muscular man, with a lion heart, tangled black locks, and a sweeping beard which covered his broad chest. When he was tried, there was no finer head in all the crowded court. It's no new thing to find the best face looking from the dock. But his good looks could not balance his bad deeds. His advocate did all he knew, but the cards lay against him, and Duncan Warner was handed over to the mercy of the big Los Amigos dynamos. I was there at the committee meeting when the matter was discussed. The town council had chosen 4 experts to look after the arrangements. 3 of them were admirable. There was Joseph McConnor, the very man who had designed the dynamos, and there was Joshua Westmacott, the chairman of the Los Amigos Electrical Supply Company, Limited. Then there was myself as the chief medical man, and lastly an old German of the name of Peter Stoopnagel. The Germans were a strong body at Los Amigos, and they all voted for their man. That was how he got on the committee. It was said that he had been a wonderful electrician at home, and he was eternally working with wires and insulators and Leyden jars, but as he never seemed to get any further or to have any results worth publishing, he came at last to be regarded as a harmless crank who had made science his hobby. We 3 practical men smiled when we heard that he had been elected as our colleague, and at the meeting we fixed it up very nicely among ourselves without much thought of the old fellow, who sat with his ears scooped forward in his hands, for he was a trifle hard of hearing, taking no more part in the proceedings than the gentlemen of the press who scribbled their notes on the back benches. We did not take long to settle it all. In New York, a strength of some 2,000 volts had been used, and death had not been instantaneous. Evidently their shock had been too weak. Los Amigos should not fall into that error. The charge should be 6 times greater, and therefore, of course, it would be 6 times more effective. Nothing could possibly be more logical. The whole concentrated force of the great dynamos should be employed on Duncan Warner. So we 3 settled it, and had already risen to break up the meeting, when our silent companion opened his mouth for the first time. "Gentlemen," said he, "you appear to me to show an extraordinary ignorance upon the subject of electricity. You have not mastered the first principles of its actions upon a human being." The committee was about to break into an angry reply to this brusque comment, but the chairman of the electrical company tapped his forehead to claim its indulgence for the crankiness of the speaker. "Pray tell us, sir," said he, with an ironical smile, "what is there in our conclusions with which you find fault?" "With your assumption that a large dose of electricity will merely increase the effect of a small dose. Do you not think it possible that it might have an entirely different result? Do you know anything, by actual experiment, of the effect of such powerful shocks?" "We know it by analogy," said the chairman pompously. "All drugs increase their effect when they increase their dose. For example—" "Whiskey," said Joseph McConnor. "Quite so. Whiskey. You see it there." Peter Stupnagel smiled and shook his head. "Your argument is not very good," said he. "When I used to take whiskey, I used to find that 1 glass would excite me, but that 6 would send me to sleep, which is just the opposite. Now suppose that electricity were to act in just the opposite way also. What then?" We 3 practical men burst out laughing. We had known that our colleague was queer, but we had never thought that he would be as queer as this. "What then?" repeated Peter Stupnagel. "We'll take our chances," said the chairman. "Pray consider," said Peter, "that workmen who have touched the wires, and who have received shocks of only a few 100 volts, have died instantly. The fact is well known. And yet, when a much greater force was used upon a criminal in New York, the man struggled for some little time. Do you not clearly see that the smaller dose is the more deadly?" "I think, gentlemen, that this discussion has been carried on quite long enough," said the chairman, rising again. "The point, I take it, has already been decided by the majority of the committee, and Duncan Warner will be electrocuted on Tuesday by the full strength of the Los Amigos dynamos. Is it not so?" "I agree," said Joseph McConnor. "I agree," said I. "And I protest," said Peter Stupnagel. "Then the motion is carried, and your protest will be duly entered in the minutes," said the chairman, and so the sitting was dissolved. The attendance at the electrocution was a very small one. We 4 members of the committee were, of course, present, with the executioner, who was to act under their orders. The others were the United States Marshal, the governor of the jail, the chaplain, and 3 members of the press. The room was a small brick chamber, forming an outhouse to the central electrical station. It had been used as a laundry, and had an oven and copper at one side, but no other furniture save a single chair for the condemned man. A metal plate for his feet was placed in front of it, to which ran a thick insulated wire. Above, another wire depended from the ceiling, which could be connected with a small metallic rod projecting from a cap which was to be placed upon his head. When this connection was established, Duncan Warner's hour was come. There was a solemn hush as we waited for the coming of the prisoner. The practical engineers looked a little pale and fidgeted nervously with the wires. Even the hardened marshal was ill at ease, for a mere hanging was one thing, and this blasting of flesh and blood a very different one. As to the pressmen, their faces were whiter than the sheets which lay before them. The only man who appeared to feel none of the influence of these preparations was the little German crank, who strolled from one to the other with a smile on his lips and mischief in his eyes. More than once he even went so far as to burst into a shout of laughter, until the chaplain sternly rebuked him for his ill-timed levity. "How can you so far forget yourself, Mr. Stupnagel," said he, "as to jest in the presence of death?" But the German was quite unabashed. "If I were in the presence of death, I should not jest," said he. "But since I am not, I may do what I choose." This flippant reply was about to draw another and a sterner reproof from the chaplain, when the door was swung open and 2 warders entered, leading Duncan Warner between them. He glanced around him with a set face, stepped resolutely forward, and seated himself upon the chair. "Touch her off," said he. It was barbarous to keep him in suspense. The chaplain murmured a few words in his ear, the attendant placed the cap upon his head, and then, while we all held our breath, the wire and the metal were brought in contact. "Great Scott!" shouted Duncan Warner. He had bounded in his chair as the frightful shock crashed through his system, but he was not dead. On the contrary, his eyes gleamed far more brightly than they had done before. There was only one change, but it was a singular one. The black had passed from his hair and beard as the shadow passes from a landscape. They were both as white as snow. And yet there was no other sign of decay. His skin was smooth and plump and lustrous as a child's. The marshal looked at the committee with a reproachful eye. "There seems to be some hitch here, gentlemen," said he. We three practical men looked at each other. Peter Stoopnagel smiled pensively. "I think that another one should do it," said I. Again the connection was made, and again Duncan Warner sprang in his chair and shouted. But indeed, were it not that he still remained in the chair, none of us would have recognized him. His hair and his beard had shredded off in an instant, and the room looked like a barber's shop on a Saturday night. There he sat, his eyes still shining, his skin radiant with the glow of perfect health, but with a scalp as bald as a Dutch cheese, and a chin without so much as a trace of down. He began to revolve one of his arms, slowly and doubtfully at first, but with more confidence as he went on. "That joint," said he, "has puzzled half the doctors on the Pacific slope. It's as good as new, and as limber as a hickory twig." "You are feeling pretty well?" asked the old German. "Never better in my life," said Duncan Warner cheerily. The situation was a painful one. The marshal glared at the committee. Peter Stoopnagel grinned and rubbed his hands. The engineers scratched their heads. The bald-headed prisoner revolved his arm and looked pleased. "I think that one more shock—" began the chairman. "No, sir," said the marshal. "We've had foolery enough for one morning. We are here for an execution, and an execution we'll have. What do you propose?" "There's a hook handy upon the ceiling. Fetch a rope, and we'll soon set this matter straight." There was another awkward delay while the warders departed for the cord. Peter Stoopnagel bent over Duncan Warner and whispered something in his ear. The desperado stared in surprise. "You don't say," he asked. The German nodded. "What? No ways." Peter shook his head, and the two began to laugh as though they shared some huge joke between them. The rope was brought, and the marshal himself slipped the noose over the criminal's neck. Then the two warders, the assistant, and he swung their victim into the air. For half an hour he hung, a dreadful sight, from the ceiling. Then in solemn silence they lowered him down, and one of the warders went out to order the shell to be brought around. But as he touched ground again, what was our amazement when Duncan Warner put his hands up to his neck, loosened the noose, and took a long, deep breath. "Paul Jefferson's sail is going well," he remarked. "I could see the crowd from up yonder," and he nodded at the hook in the ceiling. "Up with him again," shouted the marshal. "We'll get the life out of him somehow." In an instant the victim was back on the hook once more. They kept him there for an hour, but when he came down, he was perfectly garrulous. "Old man Plunkett goes too much to the Arcady Saloon," said he. "3 times he's been there in an hour, and him with a family. Old man Plunkett would do well to swear off." It was monstrous and incredible, but there it was. There was no getting round it. The man was there talking when he ought to have been dead. We all sat staring in amazement. But United States Marshal Carpenter was not a man to be euchred so easily. He motioned the others to one side so that the prisoner was left standing alone. "Duncan Warner," said he slowly, "you are here to play your part, and I am here to play mine. Your game is to live if you can, and my game is to carry out the sentence of the law. You beat us on electricity. I'll give you one there. And you beat us on hanging. for you seem to thrive on it. But it's my turn to beat you now, for my duty has to be done." He pulled a six-shooter from his coat as he spoke, and fired all the shots through the body of the prisoner. The room was so filled with smoke that we could see nothing, but when it cleared, the prisoner was still standing there, looking down in disgust at the front of his coat. "Coats must be cheap where you come from," said he. $30 it cost me, and look at it now. The 6 holes in front are bad enough, but 4 of the balls have passed out, and a pretty fine state the back must be in." The marshal's revolver fell from his hand, and he dropped his arms to his sides, a beaten man. "Maybe some of you gentlemen can tell me what this means," said he, looking helplessly at the committee. Peter Stupnagel took a step forward. "I'll tell you all about it," said he. "You seem to be the only person who knows anything." "I am the only person who knows anything. I should have warned these gentlemen, but as they would not listen to me, I have allowed them to learn by experience. What you have done with your electricity is that you have increased the man's vitality until he can deny death for centuries." "Centuries?" "Yes, it will take the wear of hundreds of years to exhaust the enormous nervous energy with which you have drenched him. Electricity is life, and you have charged him with it to the utmost. Perhaps in 50 years you might execute him, but I am not sanguine about it." "Great Scott! What shall I do with him?" cried the unhappy marshal. Peter Stupnagel shrugged his shoulders. "It seems to me that it does not much matter what you do with him now," said he. "Maybe we could drain the electricity out of him again. Suppose we hang him up by the heels." No, it's out of the question." Well, he shall do no more mischief in Los Amigos, anyhow," said the marshal with decision. "He shall go into the new jail. The prison will wear him out." "On the contrary," said Peter Stupnagel, "I think that it is much more probable that he will wear out the prison." It was rather a fiasco, and for years we didn't talk about it more than we could help. But it's no secret now, and I thought you might like to jot down the facts in your casebook. End of the Los Amigos Fiasco by Arthur Conan Doyle. Recording by Winston Tharp.